All right, so I'm actually going to start off by introducing Alan and reminding that there will be a Q&A after the performance. So feel free to submit your questions in the next couple of minutes while the performance is going on. So this event is also sponsored by incredible community partners, Modus Theater, the Department of Chicano and Chicana Studies at the Metropolitan State University of Denver, and the Matrix Center for the Advancement of Social Equity and Inclusion.
Hi everyone, my name is Marine Development Director at CIRC. Joining us today is Alan Pelaez Lopez, an Afro-Indigenous poet, installation and adornment artist from the coastal Zapotec community of Oaxaca, Mexico. They are a finalist of the 2020 International Latino Book Award, nominated for the Pushcart Prize, and appear in Best New Poets 2019 and Best American Experimental Writing 2020. Alan is also artistically, socially, and politically involved in the immigrant rights movement, working with several organizations such as the Student Immigrant Movement, the Queer Undocumented Immigrant Project, Black LGBT Migrant Project, and many more.
In 2013, Alan was named a recipient of the National Youth Courage Award for their commitment to uplifting the voices of LGBTQIA+ undocumented immigrants in the United States. They are currently living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they are a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. We are so incredibly excited and grateful to have Alan here with us today. So without further ado, Alan Pelaez Lopez.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me in the digital space tonight. I'm so excited to be here. As was mentioned earlier, I've been involved in the immigrant rights movement for quite some time. I've been organizing for about 10 years, I think 11 now, and it feels really nice to be invited to read poems, because I think that often we forget how important art is to social movements and to imagining a future better than the one that we have inherited. So I'm going to read some poems, and then we're going to have a really dynamic and intimate question and answer. So if you have questions, feel free to either type them in the chat now, and then we'll go back and look for them, or you can kind of type them now and then click send towards the end. And I wanted to start with some poems about intimacy, because I'm tired that when we talk about migrant communities, we only talk about what they do for the labor market, or we only talk about the atrocities of migration. We don't talk about the pleasure, the joy, and the messiness of migrant lives. So I want to start with that. This is titled Illegal Intimacy. Querido, do you remember the sound of our bodies undressing in the privacy of your Harlem apartment kitchen? Querido, do you miss the touch of my skin as much as I miss the touch of yours? I miss the ways in which your manos acariciaban a mis chinos. Querido, do you remember the weekly ritual of washing each other's hair? How could I forget the steel stool you'd keep in your bathroom for our Sunday morning ceremonies? One would sit and the other massage, scratch, and clean the other's scalp. I miss our intimacy. I miss the touch of your fingers untwisting and unknotting my hair. I miss the smell of warm water meeting your back, the hibiscus shea moisture conditioner making love to your scalp. Such unlawful activities that could have gotten me deported for refusing to perform good moral character, for refusing to perform heterosexuality, for refusing to shave this dique pelo malo, pelo feo, pelo sucio, and for tasting the sweetness of your flesh. At 4:55 p.m., 9:10 p.m., 3:21 a.m., 7:30 a.m., and noon. Querido, I miss our intimacy, and I am done justifying to you why you should love an illegal alien. Querido, I miss our intimacy, and sometimes I think I miss you too. But most times I know that I do not. I only miss being held, cuddled, whispered to sleep. Querido, I have hurt and learned and felt and heard and learned and felt that it may not have been your fault. It was not you who hated me. I know it was the values of a culture you inherited. Querido, when did you stop believing our conversations about Black liberation? Querido, when did you decide that your Black liberation would forever prevent mine? When did you decide that my Blackness was illegal? Was it when I could not pronounce American words in the same way as you? Did my accent shame you? Was I too foreign, too Indian, too illegal? Querido, I have spent nights thinking of what to say, what to do, what to think, what to write, what to scream. And I know it's not my fault. You could not love and care for me in the ways that I needed. But I hope you realize how fucking magnificent you were in those moments of ungovernable intimacy, unruly love, and unapologetic tears. Querido, I hope you are taking care of yourself as best as you can. Querido, one day you will denounce this culture that you, and lately I, have internalized. I will not be waiting. People get tired, querido, but someone will. Until then, it is raining here in La Bahia, and the drops are making that sound you love. It is 5 a.m., and yes, I still awake for coffee and morning writing. So yes, I am doing well without us. Thank you for asking. I wanted to open with this poem because I remember when I was really little, I migrated to the US when I was 5, alone, undocumented. And when I was really little, I remember talking to my mom and asking all her friends if they had papers or not. And for her friends who had papers, I would, when my mom and I were alone, I would tell my mom, like, why can't you just marry them? Like, we'll be fine if you marry them. And at such a young age, I didn't know what I was doing. It was surveilling my mother's intimacy. I was dictating who she was to love. I was telling her that other undocumented people were not worth love because they could not help our situation. And so I think that even as a young person, the ways in which immigration uglifies us as migrants is something that might take us a long time to unpack, but something really important to unpack, right? And intimacy for me is as political as, let's say, immigration reform, as political as citizenship. And with that, I want to continue my set for today. And this poem is one of, for me, the hardest poems to read because it serves both as my breakup letter with the immigrant rights movement, but also a commitment to a better future for Black folk and migrant folk. And this is titled, Blackness Embodied Reads the News. In under 2 months, 2 young boys of color have died, and I don't know what to do anymore. Joaquin Luna Jr. was 18 when he died. The New York Times says he committed suicide because he was undocumented. Joaquin left a letter detailing the struggles of undocumentedness. This wasn't suicide, though. This empire killed him. This empire is killing all of us. I mean, we are here. Everyone knows we are here. Yet the law names us illegal. Technically, we have no rights or legal protection, but at any moment, the law can and it will discipline us. That is to say that the law selects when it wants to author us into existence. Often, I find myself asking, is there a life after fugitivity, or is fugitivity a way of life? These have been the hardest days of my life lately. 2 months and 1 week after Joaquin's death, Trayvon Martin was killed. Trayvon was a 17-year-old Black boy. In a My Fox Orlando interview, his father tells the camera that Trayvon was only visiting him from Miami. Even for those who can legally travel in this country, their travels are met with sequestration and death. But ain't that the story of the Black condition in the Americas? And shouldn't we refuse this story, no longer tolerated? When Joaquin Luna Jr. died, I was furious and scared that none of us know how to hold each other because we are too busy avoiding our deportations and deaths. When Trayvon Martin was killed, I felt part of my spirit leave my body, and I haven't seen it return since. I am tired of our bodies being documented only after death. I'd like all of us to live, please. I want Joaquin Luna Jr. back. I want Trayvon Martin back. I want the world to love us and hold us. It's happened again and again and again. I've lost track of how many Black folk have died. I kept saving their photos on my desktop. Too many photos on my desktop that I kept messing up their names. Couldn't put a face to a name anymore. A few looked like me. Most were darker than me. A lot were younger than me. A lot of girls, actually. I'm scared. I am becoming obsessed with documenting our photographs. We, they, are forgotten so quickly. One of the latest is Nia Wilson. She was an 18-year-old Black girl waiting for the train just a couple of blocks down my house. In an online elegy, her future is spelled out. She was to own a dance studio. Days after her murder, a friend reminds me that though this violence can happen to us at any moment, this violence isn't happening to us right now. And so we hold one another, whispering into each other's ears, I love you. I love you. I love our people. I keep thinking of Trayvon Martin and Nia Wilson. I don't know what it is that I'm fighting for at this moment. I used to think that my biggest problem was being undocumented. It is not. I am learning to be Black in the United States, and it is hard. Mama reminds me that it is also as hard back home, and that is why we migrated. And still, Ama assures me that the problem isn't Blackness or indigeneity. The problem is the settler's world, particularly settler rage, settler fear, and settler citizenship. I want Joaquin Luna Jr. back. I want Trayvon Martin back. I want Nia Wilson back. I want the world to love us and hold us. To this day, I still remember the day after Trayvon Martin's murder. The day after the murder, I was supposed to speak to undocumented youth about college access. And I couldn't talk about college access. All I could talk about was the fact that a young boy had just been murdered in Florida, and that young boy was a US citizen, and that citizenship didn't protect them. So I had the high school youth talk about what is it that we need outside of papers. What if we were part of a movement that no longer asked for papers and instead demanded care and respect for all migrants? What kind of world would that be where citizenship ends and care is centered? And in light of this, I want to read a piece. I was I adjusted status a few years ago through a really intense case. I actually had to move to multiple states to do this. And this is titled Moments When I Forget I Am No Longer Illegal. Moments when I forget I am no longer illegal. 1. Outside detention centers. 2, at the site of a white minivan. 3, when on hold with a free clinic. 4, right before accepting calls from prison. 5, when I hear an unexpected knock on the door. 6, when TSA agents stick their fingers through my locks. 7, every time I am selected for special inspection at the airport. 8, when I am asked for an ID and all I have is a scanned copy of my Mexican passport because the documents are yet to arrive. 9, when lovers ask me about the past and I unintentionally speak in the present tense. And the list continues, but that shouldn't matter. What matters is that this should have never had happened, but it did, and it continues to happen. I didn't just live as an illegal alien in what is now known as the United States. I lived as an illegal alien who was also the descendants of colonized North American indigenous community members and people who arrived to the shores of the Americas and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Once auctioned and owned, my ancestors moved through this continent as communal and private property. And somehow we resisted and we continue to resist in quotidian ways because we knew back then and we know now that we are more than papers and that this hell of a nightmare, whatever it is, has an end that we are always already approaching. This receives its injuries when we hold the hands of our loved ones in public. This receives its injuries when we remember the taste of iguana stew roasting on clay bowls. This receives its injuries when we refuse to forget our roots. This receives its injuries when we dare to accept and give care. This receives its injuries when we fail and try again. This receives its injuries at the moment of engaging in creation. This receives its injuries when we choose to recognize one another and to protect one another instead of waiting for the law to recognize and protect us. To survive fugitivity, to survive undocumentedness, is to experiment with everyday forms of escape. To survive fugitivity, to survive undocumentedness, is to hold joy, grief, anger, and pleasure all in the same minute. It is not romantic. Escape and escaping tend to hurt, and escape and escaping never end because there is always something else. To survive fugitivity, to survive undocumentedness, is to experiment with the remaking, the reshaping, and the reimagination of our bodies and lives every day. And ain't that intergalactic? I wanted to share this poem with you tonight because took me a really long time to understand what papers were, and to understand that papers was something that even if one had, they could never protect you. In the United States, when slavery was still legal. People who were enslaved and ran away from plantations had to carry papers with them that said that they were free people. But there was a law that passed in the 1850s titled the Fugitive Slave Act. And what that law said, it said that any Black person who had papers that said that they were free, they could still be deported back to states that practiced slavery. So former slaves were deported to plantations, and papers never protected them. And as a descendant of slaves, I have realized that no matter what happens with my immigration status, the one thing I can no longer ask for is papers, because that has never given anybody a framework of how to care, offer love, or respect Black livelihoods and Black futures. And with this, I want to move into a poem about the future. And this is a new piece. If you see my screen moving, it is because I am using my laptop. Okay, here we go. This is titled Future Story, and it is dedicated to anybody who has ever been forced to leave home. One day, borders will be a word that we study, a word so fascinating that future generations will try to understand. And thankfully, there will be no grammar for comprehension. Nothing will be forgotten, but borders will be unimaginable because in the future, the lack of care that was necessary to oppress will be something that no one has experienced. In the future, we will bring our memory. There will be many creation stories to how we got to where we are. The creation stories will be difficult to hear and to tell. We will sob from the pain of betrayal, poor care, state-sanctioned executions, detention centers, deportations, conversion therapy, missing and murdered relatives, endangered languages, extinct species, and the disaster of bearing witness to it all. We will also shake with joy when we describe what it felt like when nations ended and when settlers realized that they were the demise of relationality. When settlers begged indigenous peoples to take care of the land, and when indigenous peoples made settlers sign papers, the same ones settlers have been so obsessed with, stating that they gave up all their laws, that they gave up all the land they had accumulated and mistreated. We will release tensions when the storytellers get to the part where the toddlers and elders made offerings so grand to the ocean, to volcanoes and dried waterscapes, that words they had never heard before started coming to them in dreams. At first, the toddlers and elders were scared, but soon enough, they realized that these were indigenous words from their languages with quiet, quiet tunes of how to finally offer and give care. The same care that the whispers and songs had once experienced, but had since been denied. None of the stories will be easy to witness or tell. In the future, our bodies will only bear to speak about the past every few years, because in those moments, we will meet some of humanity's worst atrocities, but still, we will insist on the stories. Thank you. Give me one sec. I've been practicing a lot of what might it mean to actually think about the future and see myself in that future. And when I think about that future, I think about everything that I no longer want to see. And one of the things that I no longer want to see is the deep, deep denial of care. As I continue to age and as my family continues to age, and me being the only person that has access to any form of legal immigration status, one of the things that I realized is that what we need the most is care. We need a form of care that helps us remember that we can always go back to our home countries, or that we can always leave the US and go somewhere else where we might be cared for better. I also think that we need larger visions, right? I don't want to live in the US for the rest of my life. I want to work for a future where it is easy to be Black, Indigenous, and queer in Oaxaca, Mexico, and where all of us no longer have to migrate. I want to live in a future where everybody who has left home returns to their homelands and is able to live easily, and is able to indulge in being lazy, in being selfish, in laughing and not being ashamed for it. And with this, I want to read another piece. And this is titled 18 Notes on Love. And these are literally 18 notes that I've composed on my phone in the last maybe 8 years or so. 1, I walk behind him, study his pace, check if his arms swing to the beat of his step, and scurry to catch up. I remind myself that yes, our love may not be safe, but Black and Indigenous liberation requires risk. 2, we will walk next to each other, close. On the perfect day, the tops of our hands will feel each other's warmth. A new world will begin to build. 3, and we will pretend not to notice. There is a lot of pretending here. 4, we will talk, and we will laugh. 5, at bars, we pretend there is no trauma. 6, sometimes we kiss, a peck most likely, or a longer kiss, but only when we can assure that the traffic lights will be our only witnesses. 7, we gonna get hate crimed, one will joke, as queers of color usually do. 8, we will sin and we will continue to do so often. 9, hands will slip underneath t-shirt and flesh will meet, devour and offer flesh. 10, one of us will open our eyes as we kiss, and the world that started to form will beget new forms of care. 11, we will stand outside, breathing hard or hardly breathing, as we examine each centimeter of pupil. 12, the optometrist says that the pupil determines how much light will enter the eye. And this moonlight is mischievous. Why does she insist on having us enter into one another's eyes? 13, after a thorough eye exam, his right hand will delicately move my hair and ask. 14, is it okay if we hold hands all the way tonight? 15, we will hold on for dear life. 16, heteros will brand us as radical, but in a forever era of anti-Blackness, femicides, and other settler violence, let's be precise and call it living the only way we know how, as Black, queer, and for the first time, together. 17, our future is not guaranteed here. 18, and for this reason, we create abundance where we thought there was none. One thing I will say is that if there's anything I have learned about being a migrant in the US, it is how to make abundance out of scarcity. I think about the ways in which my mama used to make, like rice and beans and plantains, really have a life of their own and be our best friends for years. I think about the ways in which undocumented queer and trans organizers were able to envision futures that included people who were very, very homophobic and transphobic to them in their lives, because their visions for the future wanted everybody to be free and offered space for reconciliation with relatives who had at one point been transphobic or homophobic or less phobic. And I also think about Black undocumented organizers who again and again have shown up, even though they are the highest deported group in the United States, and the immigrant rights movement rarely speaks about the deep complexities of Black migrants, many who right now are coming from Central America and the Caribbean. And with this, I just want to maybe share this last poem, because I really want to have an intimate Q&A with y'all. And this last poem is a text message. And this poem is the last poem in my book, and I'll read the text message. I love you lots, sad face. I think we are all collectively exhausted. Sometimes I think that everything that is happening is a dream we will wake up from. I love you too. I hope we are dreaming. I really hope we are. I don't want to normalize any of it. And I think I am starting to. We can't accept this reality. We have to refuse as hard as we can, but we need to hold each other to refuse. I want to learn to love better, to hold tighter. I ended my book like this because this text message conversation happened after the death of a toddler in a detention center. And me and my good friend from Peru were texting. And when this book was printed, around that same time, my friend was detained, who I was having that conversation with, and they are now in deportation procedures. And for me, it's this everyday reminder of the revolutionary work that we're doing as a migrant community is what my friend says. And it's that work of dreaming worlds otherwise, and of committing to loving better than we have before, and to loving better than we were loved perhaps in our home countries or by our alleged governments. So with this, I really want to open up a space to hear your voices or see your faces or read your questions, and really dialogue with one another. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Alan. I had goosebumps the entire time. So such a powerful, such an emotional performance. I can't even begin to put in words. So if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, but we will be starting the Q&A portion of tonight. And to just get us started, I actually have a question. Alan, why poetry? Out of all the forms of art in this world, what has your relationship been with poetry, and how did it start?
That's such a great question. I think that every community has poets. My family, most of my family members are illiterate, according to the university system or like the K through 12 schooling system. And my mom is a storyteller. So is my grandmother. My grandmother tells stories about Oaxaca through her weaving. And for me, that's poetry. Like chismeando is a form of poetry, right? That requires intimacy with your community. It requires knowing details. It requires exaggeration. It requires withholding of information. So I felt like growing up, I always grew up with my grandmother, the weaver, the storyteller, my mother, the poet, right? Even though she can't read or write, she speaks in poetry. And like my tias and my primos, like los en las chismosos, and las, so I felt like I was always incubated by poets. And we forget that the law is something that is written down. And I think poetry speaks back to the law. The law is saying, you are an illegal alien, you do not have a voice. And as a poet, I'm like, oh, you think I'm illegal? Look at how much I am existing in the world. Look at all the things I can say that you've done to me, and you're like this inanimate object, but I am this like living and breathing human being, right? So I think that poetry is able to speak back to empire, to speak back to like the US federal immigration system, to speak back to settler colonialism. And I think that people take poets for granted because poetry is seen as like, something that's not laborious, something that cannot advance capitalism, right? And I think it's so beautiful that there is this art form that refuses capitalism in a way. And it's like, yes, you can buy a poetry book, but you can't really like buy like poetry in that kind of way, right? So I think that it's a form of public disobedience.
Thank you, Alan. And I do want to uplift something that someone said in the chat about how they love how central care is to your work and to your vision of what the world could be. I feel like that's something I really enjoyed listening. And I wanted to ask you about if you could tell us a little more about your most recently published book. I believe it's Intergalactic Travels, Poems from a Fugitive Alien. And I know you touched upon that in some of your poems, but we would really love to hear more.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so this book, Intergalactic Travels, it talks about my migration from Mexico to the US and growing up undocumented in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, and then in California, and kind of the connections that I was making between indigenous communities in the US, Black communities in the US, and migrant communities. You know, like when I remember one of my first protests for the immigrant rights movement was probably in 2009 or 2010. And I met Sophia Wright, who is Afro-Indigenous from a community in Rhode Island. And she was sitting next to me and she was asking me what it was like to be undocumented. And I told her, and she was like, I wish that my tribe was recognized by the US, because if we were recognized, our tribe could probably give other undocumented people like citizenship in their tribal governments. And then she was like, you know, we're undocumented in some form because we have no access to our tribal communities because we're not recognized by the US. They denied us those papers. And I was like, whoa. So Intergalactic Travels tries to put in conversation the experiences of indigenous people, Black Americans, and migrants in the US as an experience that is not too distinctive from one another. Yes, they historically are formed differently, but right now we're all under very similar pressures. And it's detrimental for us to think that that indigenous sovereignty or that Black liberation or that some form of migration relief, that they're separate from each other. They actually should all come together, and we should be working across coalitions and across communities to finally feel notions of freedom, care, love, and abundance. And that's kind of what happens in this collection.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, so Laura just said in the comments, like, how can we purchase your book? And we're actually going to be sending, just for everyone out there, we're going to be sending a link so you can purchase Alan's book, because everyone should read it. And now I actually have a question from Alexis Miles. He says, love your words, intimacy with your humanity. That's so beautiful and provocative. How can we become more intimate with our humanity?
What a question. Wow. I think that one of the things that we can do is like reflect and think about when was the first time that I was hurt or that I was wounded by either a person or the world. Because I think that when we can point to one of the first moments where we experienced either shame or a feeling of unbelonging or a feeling of isolation, we'll be able to attend to that younger version of us, right? And remind ourselves that what we experience at that moment, nobody should have tolerated. And we can actually begin to address that and say, you know, like, we could not have taken care of ourselves when we were younger, but we can take care of ourselves now, right? And I think that intimacy starts with understanding where some of our wounds come from. And I don't mean like big wounds like when I cross the border, right? Like, okay, because we get it, but I mean like all the like smaller wounds that predate violences of, for example, border crossing or violences of domestic abuse, maybe like smaller wounds such as the first time maybe that you got hurt and you needed somebody to care for you and they didn't, right? Like, how can you tend for that younger person right now? Because I think that gives us framework of how we can be better relatives to those who are alive with us right now. Because it's really easy to point fingers, but what is not easy is also to like identify when we were hurt, but also when we've been bad relatives. In order to be really intimate, we have to be honest and think, when was the first time that I maybe intentionally hurt somebody and caused harm? Um, you know, those are as important as addressing when we were harmed.
I can take Naida's question next. And Naida is actually our South Regional Organizer at CIRC. She said, earlier you read us your breakup letter to the immigrant rights movement. Why in that moment of your life did you want to break up with our movement? Oops, sorry, went away. You named some of this in a few of your poems tonight, but in what ways have you felt disconnected from the immigrant justice movement in this country? Do you still feel connected to this movimento?
Thank you for that question. I had to break up with the immigrant rights movement because I thought that the way we were telling our stories as a movement were really unethical. And I also thought that the way we were using art in the immigrant rights movement was unethical. For example, one of the most shared art pieces is the Migration is Beautiful art piece. And for me, that art piece, I used to share it. I even have a t-shirt with that art piece. I have stickers of that art piece. And after witnessing so many forms of violence, I realized like, migration fucking sucks. Like, I do not want to normalize forced migration. And I felt that the narrative of migration is beautiful was normalizing migration in a way that we cannot accept right now. Migration is natural, right? And people have always migrated, but right now, migration is unnatural. And I thought that the way that the immigrant rights movement was using artists was unethical, but I also knew that I had been an unethical storyteller in my early years of organizing because I was taught to tell my story, but to only share the trauma. I remember one time when we were rallying for the 2011 DREAM Act, the 2010 DREAM Act, an older organizer telling me right before going to lobby to not share that I was queer because that wasn't going to help the immigrant rights movement, that was actually going to hold us back because it was going to take up space from the conversation of citizenship. And it's things like that from the movement that I've had to realize of what would happen. Like, some of us don't have countries to go back to. A lot of people are born in exile, right? So it's like, for people who don't have a country to go back to, how can we help them tell their story in a way that envisions the end of nations, the end of countries? For people who actually want to go back home, how can we train them to tell their stories to honor that vision of, I am undocumented, like my biggest dream is to go back home, right? That should be a valued story in the immigrant rights movement, as much as a story of, I am a hard worker or I am not a criminal. And for me as an artist, narrative is so important. We need to shift the narrative of migration in order for us to actually get better futures. And in that poem, I was like, you know, Joaquin Luna Jr. left a letter detailing the struggles, but the immigrant rights movement did not pay attention to the letter. They just paid attention to his death and kind of used his death as like a moment to organize and mobilize for policy, but not to organize and mobilize for the spirit of all migrants, for the well-being, right? Because it's like this person outlined everything that was wrong, but the migrant justice movement didn't really read any of that. They just focused on like the afterthought. So like, I was like, no, this person left us so many things to work with. When Trayvon Martin was murdered, Trayvon Martin was murdered by a Peruvian man. And as a person from Latin America, in my mind, I was like, holy crap. This Latin American man saw this Black man as unfit to be in a world with, so killed this Black boy, right? And it's like, as a Latin American, for me, Trayvon Martin's death shattered me, because I was like, fuck, not even in Latin American communities will I be safe, because the Latin American is who killed Trayvon Martin. And when Nia was murdered, it happened in my own neighborhood, right? And it was this idea of, where is the migrant justice movement when everyday violences happen to those whose citizenship is never respected, to those who live on the fringes of citizenship? So like queer and trans folk, sex workers, Black folk. So for me, I still believe that we can have a migrant future, but that migrant future requires us to be honest about how we have failed each other as migrant organizers.
Thank you so much. That was a great response. We have another question from Ian. He also works with CIRC. He says, I liked how you talked about the future we dream of. I know you mentioned a bit in your poems, but I'm wondering if you can share a bit of the future you dream of.
Yes, okay. So, I think that like, in order for me to be safe in the future, and for me to be able to live like a good life, um, I think I need Mexico to kind of cease to exist. And I need people to stop looking for identities based on, stop looking for belonging based on identities. I think that identities are really important, but I think that identities are unauthentic. There is no way that a random Black person in the street is going to care for me just because we're Black, right? Like, building relationships based off of identity is superficial because it doesn't share like a vision, right? But if I meet a person in the street who has a similar vision as me of liberation or of abolition, then I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to build with you. I think that the future that I imagine is a future where our relationships are centered on visions and not on identities. Identities are super important right now because people are being minoritized, people are being systematically targeted out, right? And that's when identities become important. Of, let's organize around identities because these laws are saying like, we're going to eliminate you, right? That's important. But I think that in my future, the foundation of relationships has nothing to do with like sexuality, age, ability status, class status, but with the vision, right? And it is, my future, I think, is also a future where we learn to really, how do I say this in a way that makes sense? I want a future that no longer depends on punishment. I think that an abolitionist future requires us to make space for those who have hurt us and those who have hurt us deeply, right? I want a future where accountability isn't a trend word. I want a future where people get to say, I don't want to be in relation with you, and people respect that and never attempt it again. And also, I want a future where the person that has said, I do not want a relationship with you, changes her mind and says, actually, I thought I didn't want a relationship, now I was wrong, I do. I want a future full of contradictions, because contradictions is what allows us to understand our complexities, right? Because it's like, I just gave this whole reading about how papers will not protect us, and yet I'm like a resident, right? So it's like those contradictions really inform how we imagine more and what we no longer tolerate. I want us to make, in our future, I want us to make lists of everything we will not tolerate and everything we want to keep. That's like a future that I want.
Thank you, Alan. Kirsten Wilson asked, how do you care for yourself?
Great question. I think that care for me has come in quietness. I really value my quietness. there used to be a moment in my life where everybody and their friend had like my WhatsApp or my Signal, and I would just be getting random messages on Signal or WhatsApp of like, this case is about to like have a hearing like tomorrow. And, you know, that's important. And also like, I had to realize I can't be at every PACMA court, or I can't be at every like state house hearing, or translate every time a translator is needed. So right now, I think that I really value quietness, and I see quietness as what gives me like life. Um, to be able to just kind of like, I love to listen to music, and to be able to just play music and sit in my couch, or to just go to a park and sit with like my phone and my headphones, that I think reminds me that even in the worst of times, um, there are still moments of pleasure that we can transgress. Um, Another thing that gives me a lot of care is seeing my siblings smile. Both of them, they're drastically younger than me. They're half my age. They're in high school, and to hear about their day and to just see how curious they are about the world, it makes me smile so much, because it's like, for my mother, the big goal was for her kids to live easily, and to see my brother and sister live easily is such, um, it makes me so happy. Um, and I'm just like, wow, my mom really did it. Her dream came true. Like, Diego is the happiest he's ever been. Like, you know, my sister as well, like she's doing what she loves. She doesn't have to worry about shit. So that's what's giving me like a lot of care and joy right now.
Awesome. We have another question from Crystal. She says, thank you for sharing your art with us, Alan Hart. Who or what is your biggest source of inspiration at the moment?
Wow, what a question. Oof. Okay, so I think I have a few. If any of you have ever heard of the writer Edwidge Stanticat, she is a writer from Haiti. She writes children's books, novels, and essays. She has this beautiful essay collection called Create Dangerously, The Immigrant Artist at Work. And for me, that book has just resurrected so much curiosity. She talks about how in some countries, artists are the first to be disappeared by the government, because artists are the ones that let everybody know, yo, this is fucked up. We cannot stand for it, right? Artists are like the first organizers in many countries. And for me, that book has been so special to realize it is as an artist, it is my ethical duty to continue to like create work around what is happening in the world. So I love her work. I'm also really, really touched by the work of Jennifer Tamayo. Jennifer Tamayo is a 4 million documented performance artist, video artist, and poet from Colombia. And she has a beautiful but really hard collection called To Kill the Future in the Present. And she was in a detention center as a toddler, and it chronicles her mom and her escaped detention together. And it talks about their escape and what it means to have survived detention 30 years ago and then see children being detained. And she talks about how the same a detention center a few miles away from when she was held 30 years ago is the same detention center that recently banned the use of Crayola crayons, because immigration was saying that youth were vandalizing government property. So she talks about like wanting to give love to children in detention. And she does so by talking about her own experience. And for me, I think that that has been super powerful. And she also criticizes the notion of like children in cages, because for her, it's like, I don't want my story to be revolved around the cage. I want my story to be revolved around the hug of my mother inside that detention center. And for her, it's like, what if immigrant rights activists stop talking about cages and start talking about the realities of us? Why don't they ask us, What was the most intimate thing that happened to you in detention? What is a form of pleasure that you experience inside the detention, so that you can begin to see people who have been detained as people who live multi-sensorial lives, multi-dimensional lives, who are still capable of pleasure and erotic life, intimacy inside the worst of circumstances.
We have another couple of questions, but I know we're at time. I just want to make sure, Alan, it's okay with you to maybe go over a little bit. Is that fine? Okay. So from Mary, what is your doctoral dissertation subject matter?
Wow, what a question. I never talk about that. It's so weird. But I will talk about it because you asked about it. I write about citizenship. Big reveal, right? So I write about the ways in which during like slavery and during the assimilation era, there was no definition of citizenship. Citizenship was used just to give white male property owners a form of purpose in the United States. And to be a citizen, that was the requirement. You had to be white, you had to own property, and you had to be a man. So that is where our understanding of citizenship comes in the United States. And I write about the ways in which contemporary undocumented Black artists are teaching us that citizenship is also operating similarly in their countries of birth. So I look at artists from Kenya, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and Venezuela, and talk about how these Black artists who are undocumented in the United States critique citizenship in their home country and put it in conversation with a larger system of settler conquistador violence. So yeah, that's to keep it short.
Awesome. And then we have a question from Ale. She says, sometimes it is hard to find the words when you need to write them down through poetry, especially when this world makes you feel heavy. I am an empath, so it gets hard to not let what is happening in the world not affect me that much. What is your advice to move past a mental block when you want to write a poem?
Wow, this reminds me a lot of my friend in the poem that I read, where she tells me that the violence can happen to us at any moment, but it isn't happening to us right now. And then we pretty much literally, I remember the day we were just sitting in a couch together and we kept like, we were holding hands, like massaging each other's hands, and we were saying, I love you to each other. And I think that when one gets really down, one has to remember like, okay, in this moment right now, what is happening to me? In this moment, am I facing a deportation order? Or in this moment, can I take like some time off for myself? Can I actually tend to myself? I think that for people who are empaths, I think that sometimes one thing that can be a struggle is realizing that in that moment, they can prioritize themselves and not either the story they are listening to or the friend that is venting to them, but being able to like stop and be like, oh, wait, I actually like feel all these things right now. I can't, right? And I think similar with poetry, I tell people sometimes I can't write for months. And I think there's other forms of practicing my craft. I think that like watching films or listening to music is a form of studying. They all make me a better poet. I think that when one is having writer's block, being okay with not doing it should be normalized, right? Because as a writer, if I'm like, I have to write because I'm a writer, I'm like, I'm only feeding into the capitalist idea that I'm only valuable if I'm producing. And that idea of production, one, creates disabled bodies. Like hyperproductivity makes people disabled, right? It makes our body react in ways that it reached the breaking point, right? So I think that as cultural producers, we have to also realize, okay, when I create, is it because I feel forced to create, or is it because it's actually coming from my own desire?
Thank you for that, Alan. And I feel like a lot of people, regardless of what they do, can really relate to what you said about hyperproductivity can make us disabled. I know a lot of people in the, whatever, organizing type of work or any type of work that they do can really relate to that. And I did want to ask you a quick question that has been on my mind. And it's a bit long-winded, so bear with me. But I was wondering, with your experience and your life, what your insight and thoughts were on the intersectionality of struggles that immigrants and Indigenous people face, BIPOC people face, LGBTQIA plus folks face, but not just in the US, but also in other countries. And I'm thinking specifically about current events at the moment and what's happening in Palestine. And I know earlier in one of your poems, you talked about how the problem was the settlers' world. And so I'm thinking, about Palestinians getting evicted from their homes. They have lived there for generations. The apartheid regime they've been under, the war crimes they've suffered from. But yeah, it seems like most people see this as a separate issue. And I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on all of this. And I know it's a really big question. But any insight you could share?
That's an incredible question, because I think that when we talk about, or when the media talks about migrants, they never talk about why people migrated, right? They're just saying migrants this or immigrants that, but it's like, well, why are they here? And I think that gets us to the root, right? A lot of people migrate not just because we're like, oh, I want to go to the US and then overstay the visa. Yeah, that happens sometimes. People might overstay a tourist visa when they were actually on vacation here, but that is rare. What is important is like people migrate because of like settlement, right? Imperialism. One of my favorite writers is Ola Osase. He's a trans man from Nigeria. He was undocumented in the US for about 2 decades. And he talks about how, like, Nigeria was a colony of Britain, right? And his parents grew up with Britain colonization of Nigeria. And then when he was a young person, he was forced to leave because Britain left Nigeria and left Nigeria in absolute ruckus. There was like no livable life in Nigeria at the time. And Ola talks about how like he moves to the US with his mother, but the US is pretty much Britain's second cousin, or Britain's like step sibling, right? And how the same systems of oppression he and his family were facing in Nigeria because of like British colonialism, he's also facing in the US because of a form of Anglo colonialism. They're rooted in the same place. And when we're thinking about Palestine, right? I think that the largest population of Palestinians in like this continent is in Latin America. And it's, I know that there's quite a bit of Palestinians in Oaxaca. And for me, it's like, whoa, like people are literally living in Oaxaca because it's unlivable. There's Palestinians in Oaxaca because they've already left somewhere else because their country was unlivable. So we're seeing like mass and masses of migration everywhere because countries keep terrorizing and territorializing, right? One thing that what's happening in Palestine is teaching us is the violence of nation states, right? Because the nation state of Israel, as many scholars have scholars, artists, and people both in Palestine and outside Palestine have pointed out, is that Israel is both detrimental to Palestinians and to people who practice Judaism, right? Like for Jewish folk, like the state is also detrimental because the state is saying, this is who you are to be if you are to belong. And before there was a state, there was no rule of how one was to be, right? It was just one is in relation to everybody else. So looking at how nation states create some of the most inhumane conditions that then create inhumane actions. In order for us to be better people, we need to undo the state, or we need the state to like undo itself. And I feel like a broken record because I keep saying that, but it makes a lot of sense. And we also forget that like immigrants are also like, many immigrants are indigenous, many immigrants are disabled, many immigrants are like, chronically sick, many immigrants are of many different religions. So it's like, there is no like migrant figure. And it's like, immigration right is for immigrant right justice is for everybody, because anybody can become an immigrant at any moment. Like even US citizens, like if a war happens and the US is the place that gets attacked, we will see hundreds of migrants that are from the US.
Thank you so much. I do want to be conscious of time. Thank you everyone who has stuck around. We did have a question from Janelle of how can we support you in your creations. We're going to be sending an email after this event that has all of Alan's books, so you can purchase all of them if you so desire. And then we will also be sharing in the chat a link to all of Alan's social media if you would like to follow them. So yeah, if you liked today's events and you haven't gotten a chance to donate already, we're also going to be putting that link in the comments. All contributions will go towards our programs, and no amount is too small. No matter what you can give, we want you to be a part of our movement and our community. And I'll turn it over to Maureen.
So sorry, I was typing in the chat. I don't even know what I'm supposed to say. But I just wanted, to thank everyone. Thank you, Alan. This has been wonderful. And I'm really excited to honestly purchase your latest book. I really loved all of your poems. And I feel like, based on reactions in the chat, it sounds like a lot of people were really touched tonight. And so, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you for your time, Alan.
Thank you, everybody, for having me and like bearing witness to all of this. I hope that you are taking care of yourselves. And thank you so much again.
That's it for tonight's event. So thank you all and have a great Thursday.
Good night.